Hello, and thank you for joining this seminar. I want to introduce Claire Nickling, who is the regional representative for the Andes region for CCRP. And I want to start by asking her about their experience with network analysis. And my question to you is, in your opinion, why do we need to understand social networks in the work of CCRP?
So if the underlying question of social analysis being a method, the question is how knowledge is shared and created, because sometimes in the network there's a creation moment, and also it's not just technology transfer, right? It's who's co-creating knowledge, how's it created, how do networks inform that, and how is it shared? With the hopes of us all becoming more efficient, if we understand that, we're not just communicating in kind of this one-way channel or making assumptions. We can understand how it works and use that to share and create knowledge. In the projects of the Andes, that that one in Northern Potosi, it was, what are the type of person who should be part of the conversation of the network? So nutrition, it's not just the mother. We found if we brought the father in, if we brought the older siblings, if you bring the mother-in-law in, then the nutrition outcomes change. So a classic network analysis that we learned was, these very heavy surveys where you list individuals. Who are you talking to? And that can be very hard because there might be 500 people in a network or 1,000. We don't know all the names. But if you ask for type of person, do you get your information from your neighbors? Do you get it from a family member, someone from the church, an extension agent, a women's group? Then that can also be interesting. Like, who are the nodes of information? So I think what we've seen in this work on the project level and in the CCRP is, one, starting with a lot of qualitative observation. Sometimes I don't realize who I'm being inspired by. So first, some deeper interviews and observation about what are nodes that, before you go to a survey, and then go to a survey that can ask about types. So if you observe that, wow, the mother-in-law has a lot of influence on the family's diet, then you can ask. But if you don't know that, you can't ask that. And then likewise, when you ask what specific people. So I've seen it be successful when we do some observation and deep interviewing to understand where that could be. And I'm just reading Rick Coe's new paper about motivation. So like a big part of that, he mentions, and many authors do, about we're all part of a social context and we're being influenced by that. So I think a lot of the network analysis is trying to understand who really influences us. Less important than the actual method in the survey was, to me, opening people's minds, people who might be from communities, farmer leaders, NGO folks, researchers, to look at social dynamics in a community, because not everyone has the same. There's these informal leadership positions that can be invisible. Who people really listen to, it's not always the village leader. It's not always the person they're supposed to listen to. So keeping your eyes open for that kind of qualitative observation of like, who seems to have influence, even if it's not formally recognized. One basic skill that maybe everyone needs in the ecosystem of CCRP, some people are naturally much better at this and already constantly are looking at social relationships and tracking that and seeing who has influence, who doesn't. Some people are oblivious to it, but we all need to be looking at that if we care about agroecological transitions, because the social part of how information is flowing is really important. And so some people are very natural observers of that. And often women, because women are more socialized to observe that way. And so it was funny in that workshop where a lot of, again, people who are from the community, they just don't notice that, oh, we're only working with evangelicals, or we're only working with Catholics, or we're only working with these these extended kinship networks. And then I thought the quantitative can be helpful. We did a quantitative assessment of our COP, which was a closed system of the 50 people who were in the room. And all of a sudden you see weak and strong ties, like we were talking about the other day, of social capital. So everyone was connected, but the questions that were asked got at, like, who do you go to first? Who do you listen to? Who do you go to for advice about your project? Who do you go to about advice about soils? Who do you go to hang out with at meal times? And all of a sudden you had like 5 clusters. And within those clusters, there was usually one person who I call a pollinator, who was very strongly connected. And the regional team was kind of in the middle. It wasn't part of a cluster. Everyone was connected to the regional team because it's our job to be connected to everyone. But then you saw that there was like maybe 5 or 6 other people, because of their personality or because of the way they interact, who were highly connected not only to their group, they're bridgers. They also go to other groups. Your qualitative observations are nice, but they can be very biased. You don't see everything. So like, if I don't get along with you, Carlos, you might be a great bridger, but I don't have a lot of contact with you, so I don't see that. So we're limited by, so I think both, mixed methods are always nice. So when you do a survey like that, people who you never thought were bridgers turn out to be bridgers. How can you use that information? You can, instead of always having webinars inviting everyone, you can really try to more specifically get information or try to have deeper conversations with these bridgers, knowing that they're getting out more. And in a way, you could say some of the support people that we've picked over the years to like have a broader mandate in the COP are people who are naturally bridgers. Trying to find those bridgers and work, and in communities too. They always say in these projects like the Apuchiris who have lead farmers, it's not the best farmers, it's the farmers who other farmers trust, who have those soft skills. So really noticing that skill of people who, for whatever reason, other people tend to listen to. So it can be both, because sometimes the quantitative or the more systematic methods flush out people that we sometimes have a systematic bias of not seeing, and or help us question some of our observational.
What I appreciate
things
about what you are doing now is you're giving us real examples of how, through the process of observation and then probably deeper understanding through quantitative methods of how the networks are formed, one can use them to answer specific questions. So you have highlighted a number of things. So the different functions that individuals have within those networks, the ability to discover connections that are not visible, the need to customize the tools that we use to construct the networks to focus on a specific aspects that we are interested in terms of nodes and the type of information that flows between them.
But you need some points over time, and that brings me to, in Romis, they did a network component to Romis that you could choose to add that wasn't with names. It wasn't like, do you know Carlos Barona? But it was, where are you getting your information? Who are you selling your crops to? Who, different things that you would use a network for. Where do you get information from? Where do you get money from? And things like kinship, church, extension workers, and trying to get a sense of neighbors, community, of this bridging and bonding kind of network.
Basically, the outcome is not a network that with proper names, but is a network where the functioning of the systems is described through node types and linkages of different characteristics.
Exactly. It's really helpful too for consumers of agroecology. We've seen some mapping by type of consumer, and then doing a communication campaign that gets to those node type. And another way, I guess, you could we've been working with TikTok or social media influencers, and then you look at all of their numbers. I mean, this is getting more into like just communication, maybe less network, but you see their numbers of people they reach, and then people who tweet, pass on their message. And that's also kind of a network too, right? And how, so you can see these nodes of people who are influencers and who they're influencing and who gets. So maybe that's probably more realistic for a lot of CCRP projects than a name. I mean, there is a name of the influencer, but like exactly who they get to, but like understanding their networks.
And I think that highlights a different type of research question that for me is more useful. Is not who individually is part of the network, which in some cases is important. In our cases, what are the types of individuals and what are the functions that they fulfill, and within a specific setting, where are they likely to be and what sort of information flows between them, without having to know in every case the names of all the members of the network. There might be some of them, key nodes, bridges that we know, but the rest of them probably are types. Claire, I wanted to ask you a question, and is whether you have any hints or recommendations for any colleagues that are interested in exploring how to use social network analysis in their work in research of the type that we do for CCRP, say within FRNs, or say when developing action research?
I think all of us can benefit from constantly trying to see who's participating, who's not, in very subtle ways. The FRN observation protocol has some like easy prompts of that. Like I always say the main question is who's coming and who's not coming. So like when you're in a community or wherever, you have to not just look at who's in the workshop. You have to look at why is that woman over there with her animals? What's she doing? Why is she not coming? Or ask the people, you know, ideally have that conversation as a community, not in an extractive way, but in a reflective way. Who's not here and why are they not here? So I think in the FRN observation protocol, there's a lot of those prompts of like, who's not here and how do networks, again, a network is different from a group because not everyone needs to touch the information. And that's good because time is precious resource. So the idea is like, not everyone needs to come to every workshop if there's a network defined. So I think that's a great way to start, to think about types, to start observing the social, who's sharing, to constantly be aware of like who listens to who, how does social pressure work, you know, how does influence work, and then to apply that everywhere. And I think it's really important in diversity, equity, and inclusion, who is not seemingly participating in a strong way, and how do we include them? So that's where I think the second, it can be very strong, and every project needs to be doing some level of social network to understand who's being excluded. And so, yeah, often you'll see these as very, wow, there's no Catholics at this. It's a religious exclusion. It's a gender, it's an age, it's economic level exclusion. And that can be very powerful because then you can adjust things so that, so I think the DEI part is very important too when we think about networks, because there's people being excluded.
And how would you react to this statement? If you're going to get into quantitative social network analysis, you need to think carefully about where you want to get to, because the investment in collecting and processing the information is very high.
And it's so fleeting. Yeah, so I think I can give you some insights if you're really trying to find with the very formal, with the names. It's hard to think of a project that would benefit from that because it's so dynamic. And I did want to mention that when you asked for an example, one that we put in the COP paper is when something emerges, often you see it, it's almost like a flash mob in networks. When there's a big crisis point, like fall armyworm, that's when you saw these networks mobilizing in a much more, when there's like a very, you can see it around political, like coups, or when there's like a very, here it was Punto Morado, when there's a very specific and acute problem, all of a sudden the network blossoms and there's tons of activity and you do have 10,000 or thousands of people. And then that's okay for it to retract and to think about your own life and how you mobilize when there's an election or whatever. These networks can expand and retract. So when you do such a formal analysis, the moment you take the data, it's already passed. It's like it's already on a shelf, and maybe that network doesn't exist in the same way even 2 weeks later. So yeah, it's hard to think of times except when you're trying to have an insight, but I think a lot's published on that kind of insight that we got when we did it for the COP, of who are these influencers. It's hard to think of times when that's going to be necessary, but it does feel like very necessary to do better for FRNs to do better monitoring of the network. I personally think by type and by number. It sounds not, progressive to talk about numbers, but I think we have to talk about real numbers of how big these networks are. If we're talking about systems transformation, I think CCRP projects sometimes, even if on the paper there's thousands of farmers or whatever, we have to be realistic about how many are actively, and we've been discussing this, like what is active participation, but how are these networks working to really, sometimes we don't like to talk about scale, but we have to understand better the scale of these changes and how they're expanding or how they're reaching people.